Thanks for joining in for another session of Beyond What Is Written. Today we're discussing God Who Hardens. We're continuing along in our study of Romans 9, in which we've been looking at the synergistics position on Romans 9. Today we're focusing on Romans 9 verses 17 through 18. Last week we were looking at the vessels prepared for destruction. That was verses 19 through 24. So we're kind of working in reverse order. But what I want to do is connect some dots, even between what we looked at last week and what we're going to get into this week, if I can. And so we're going to hop over to the presentation view. I'm going to read a focus passage, and we're going to look at a few clips that presents the synergistic position. And then I want to just give you an overview of the the main difference in the monergistic interpretation and synergistic interpretation, and allow you to understand why that interpretation is so important and how it changes the text and changes what Paul is conveying in the text before we do a deep dive into the critique that we're going to get into. All right, so let's hop over to the presentation view. All right, and I want to read from verse 14 through 18. The focus text, at least what we're going to see in Eclipse, is going to be 17 through 18, but I like to pick up a little context because verse 17 and 18 just didn't spawn out of midair, right? The author, Paul, God through Paul, is trying to, or he has developed the foundation, and we should try to understand his thoughts. So let's start at 14, and it reads, "What shall we say then? There is no injustice with God, is there? May it never be. For he says to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I have compassion. So then, it does not depend on the man who wills or the man who runs, but on God who has mercy. For the scripture says to Pharaoh, for this very purpose I raised you up, to demonstrate my power in you, and that my name might be proclaimed throughout the whole earth. So then, he has mercy on whom he desires, and he hardens whom he desires." So that's the focus text. And the one thing I want you to understand is that the main difference between the synergist and a monergist view is found in a couple of words. One, you're going to hear reactive, meaning that God's action for the synergist is a reaction based upon man's volitional act, right? Opposed to the monergist is saying God's action is not based upon any volitional action of man, but purely on God's intention and purpose that he has derived from eternity past. It's based on God's purpose and plan, nothing else. And that is the main difference between the two different interpretations. And I think you're going to see that clearly. And so that changes the text, or the reading of this text, shall I say, in a way. And we have to ask ourselves, when we finish the critique, does the position that we hold to align with what the author is trying to convey? Or are we changing what the author is trying to convey to be in alignment to what we have presuppositions on? And so we need to consider that, and I want you to consider that after you hear the two different positions, and you study out the passages that's put before you. All right, and so another thing I want you to consider is when you read verse 17 and 18, and you see Paul is quoting from Exodus, ask yourself, is Paul giving you his understanding of God's working in Exodus? Or is Paul pointing us to Exodus so that we will get a better understanding of how God is working in Romans 9 in regards to hardening? Purely in regards to hardening. Is Paul trying to tell us we should understand how God's working and hardening purely based upon what's explicit in Exodus? Or is Paul telling us this is how God was working in Exodus based upon what he has already established within his foundation in Romans 9? So I want you to think about those things. All right, so the first thing I want to do is give you a definition of hardening. And my definition of hardening that I came up with was, and this is based upon the two different words that is used in Exodus, because like in Exodus 7:13, there's two different words that are used. There's kazah, that means to be strengthened, to be firm, to be hardened, and then there's kashet, right? And that means to be obstinate, to be hardened, to be stiff, to be stubborn, right? To be rebellious. And so the definition I came up with from a biblical reading, a biblical study, is strengthening or affirming one's volitional faculties to its corrupt and rebellious disposition, to be obstinate or stiff in rebellion. That's my definition. I believe that aligns with the definition that the synergists give. In fact, I don't think I popped this one up, but I will play the video in which they define their terms, because that's important. So this is the first position. This is Mike Winger. He is not a Calvinist. He is not an Arminian.
And the Lord said to Moses,
sorry. He is not a Calvinist. He doesn't claim to be an Arminian. He claims to be probably somewhere in the middle. But he does have a synergistic view of the gospel, salvation. And so I think he does a good job in presenting their position, the synergistic position. And so let's listen to what he says, how he defines hardening.
and the Lord said to Moses, when you go back to Egypt, see that you do all those wonders before Pharaoh, which I have put in your hand, but I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go. Now that word, hazak, in the Hebrew, what it means is to strengthen. Harden might not be the best translation, but it means to strengthen or to firm up something. And so God is firming Pharaoh's heart. He's firming Pharaoh's heart. He's solidifying something in its current position. That's when you harden something, you're just solidifying in its current, already focused position. Pharaoh's heart is already defiant against God, already rebellious against God, and God's going to stiffen that, make him more stubborn in that. So it's not to cause him to become evil, but it locks him down in that place. That's my understanding of hardening. I could get into a whole lot of different language stuff, but I think let's just keep it simple as much as we can.
All right, so that's the definition he provides for hardening. I think it's in alignment to what I provided. So there's no real difference there. So I want to kind of start from his conclusion, and then I want to tell you, then I want to show the clips that shows how he gets to his conclusion. So this is his position summed up.
I am not saying that's the whole answer, because God hardened Pharaoh's heart. It seems like an activity that God did to Pharaoh's heart. But I think that there's an element of truth that's there that'll come in more as we keep looking at other passages. So we're going to look at some other examples tonight as well. God's sovereignty is seen then in that he picked Pharaoh and raised him up to be this. You're going to be the Pharaoh of Egypt. I know you'll resist me, and I'm going to harden your heart. But I think it's safe to say you deserve it. That seems to be the teaching. Does that make you uncomfortable? Welcome to the club. It doesn't actually bother me at all, to be honest. But a lot of people are uncomfortable by this. But I want to stick to just what the text says.
All right, so as you can see, he says God hardens, and it's because man deserves it. He says God raised Pharaoh up, and there's another clip in which he elaborates on this, but it's essentially because God has knowledge that Pharaoh will resist him. And so because God has knowledge by looking down this corridor of time that Pharaoh will resist him, God puts Pharaoh in position to resist him. So again, God is the order of events is God's work is reactive to man's work. It's reactive in this case to Pharaoh. Right? He mentions that Pharaoh was already in a position of his disposition towards God was rebellious. And that's true. That is true. We both the synergists and monergists will agree on that point. The difference between the synergists and monergists in regards to the natural disposition of Pharaoh is that essentially when you get back to the fall, you would say Pharaoh's corrupt nature is a byproduct of the fall, which makes him rebellious. And the monergist believes that God has predestined and purposed the fall. And so at the end of the day, despite Pharaoh's disposition being rebellious, his natural disposition, that natural disposition is a result of what God had purposed, the fall, right? Opposed to the synergist position would be that disposition and that rebelliousness of Pharaoh is based upon his own quote-unquote free will. All right, so how does Mike Winger gets to the position that God hardens Pharaoh because he deserves it? And it's probably not coming out clear based on his summary that he believes that God's hardening is a reaction to Pharaoh's hardening his own heart, but that's what these other clips is going to bring out. All right, so I believe the focus passage here is Exodus 7:3. I think I have Exodus open already. Let me hop over to Exodus 7:3 because I want to look at this passage right after he speaks. All right, so that's Exodus 7:3. Let's listen to what he presents in regards to Exodus 7.
So far, God has said twice that he will harden Pharaoh's heart. Has God hardened his heart yet? No. And this is where some of the commentators get it wrong. They act like these statements are God actually doing it, when God's saying he'll do it and him doing it are two different things. I will do it, future tense. Let's read.
All right, what is he referring to when he says God has said twice? All right, so he started in Exodus 7:3. The first time God mentions hardening Pharaoh's heart is in Exodus 4. So actually, if we go back to Exodus 4, let's read that one. It's 421. It reads, Then the Lord said to Moses, when you go back to Egypt, see that you perform before Pharaoh all the wonders which I have put in your power, but I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go. So God is telling Moses this before he even goes to Egypt. And he tells them to see that you do all the things, perform all the signs that he's told them, so that Pharaoh, he says, perform before Pharaoh all the wonders. So perform all the wonders before Pharaoh, and I will harden his heart. And so this is before he goes into Egypt. And then we get the story of the labor increase, which tells us Pharaoh's disposition, natural disposition, towards God's people and God's will before we even get to Exodus 7, right? And it's not good, right? He increases the labor of the work of the people when Moses and Aaron comes and asks him to release the people. And so this is before God has hardened his heart. All right. And so what he says is in Exodus 7:3, after Moses has went to Pharaoh and asked him to release his people, and Pharaoh has basically made things hard and tough on the people, and the people go back to Aaron and Moses and ask them, what have you done? You made things worse for us. And now, and then Moses goes and he asks God, why did you send me to Pharaoh? He has pretty much just made things harder for your people, right? And so now God is telling Moses, he says, Then the Lord said to Moses, see, I make you as God to Pharaoh, and your brother Aaron shall be your prophet. You shall speak all that I command you, and your brother Aaron shall speak to Pharaoh, that he let the sons of Israel go out of his land, but I will harden Pharaoh's heart, that I may multiply my signs and my wonders in the land of Egypt. Right? So this is where he is in his speech, right?
Read on, Exodus 7, verse 13. Pharaoh responds to God telling him and plagues and things like this. And it says, and Pharaoh's heart grew hard, and he did not heed them, as the Lord had said. Now, this is not God doing the action. This is just simply Pharaoh's heart just grew hard. Pharaoh's not doing it. God's not doing it. It's just a natural result of what's going on. His heart grows hard. Now, if you want to say, well, obviously God did that. Well, there's a whole other group of people who will say, obviously Pharaoh did that. I'm going to stick with the text and say, no one's given credit for this. It seems as though this part of his heart growing hard.
And I'm sorry, he actually is referring to verse 13 in Romans 7. He alluded to verse 3, in which he was saying that God said he will harden them in a future tense, but he had not done it yet. And so now what he's referring to is in verse 13, when Moses goes to the people. So let's read this. Now the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, when Pharaoh speaks to you, saying, work a miracle, then you shall say to Aaron, take your staff and throw it down before Pharaoh, that it may become a serpent. So Moses and Aaron came to Pharaoh, and thus they did just as the Lord had commanded. And Aaron threw his staff down before Pharaoh and his servants, and it became a serpent. Then Pharaoh also called for the wise men and the sorcerers, and they also the magicians of Egypt did the same with their secret arts. For each one threw down his staff, and they turned into serpents. But Aaron's staff swallowed up their staff. Yet Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he did not listen to them, as the Lord has said. All right. So when he reads this verse in verse 13, he comes here, and most synergists comes here, and they say, well, here it just gives you more of like a passive action that Pharaoh's heart was hardened, so there's no way to determine. It doesn't really give you who's the subject of the action. And so we shouldn't really give any credit to God or Pharaoh, is how he's looking at this text. But that conclusion is overlooking one critical clause in verse 13 and many of the verses that comes after this. I would say the next 4 or 5 verses that comes after this. And that is the pointer back to verse 3. At the end, it says, as the Lord had said. It says, yet Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he did not listen to them, as the Lord has said. So when it says, as the Lord has said, it's taking you back to verse 3 and the prophecy that God is giving to Moses and Aaron about what he will do. I will harden Pharaoh's heart, that I may multiply my signs. So here in verse 3, the subject is clear that God says he will harden Pharaoh's heart. Right? This is God speaking of moving on Pharaoh's volitional faculties to ferment, to strengthen it towards his own rebellious and stubborn disposition. Right? And so when it says, as the Lord has said, we have to look back and we have to say, well, this is God fulfilling what he has promised that he would do to Pharaoh's heart when he performs these miracles. When Moses performs the wonders. He promised it in Exodus 4:21, and now he's promised it again. He promised it again in Exodus 7:3, and now we're seeing the first fulfillment of it. And so this is how the monologist does not ignore the as the Lord has said. And therefore the monologist will conclude that the passive work that's being described here is really a work of God. Now, could it be that God is working by secondary causes in this text? Perhaps. Perhaps he's using, or he has purpose, that these sorcerers and magicians of Egypt perform the same signs in order for him or Pharaoh to be stiffened or hardened in his disposition, current disposition, that is the rebellious disposition, right? It's like when we are totally against something, right? And if someone does a miracle, what's supposed to be a miraculous work, but then someone disproves that and say, "Oh, I can show you the same thing." That action of what that person has done in trying to mimic or mimicking what God has brought forth as the miraculous, my heart will naturally accept that and say as a reason why I should hold firm to my position. So it could be secondary causes why God used a passive, but all the same, whether passive or active, God is the one who's purposed this hardening. He's the one who is the cause of the hardening, whether it's passive or primary or secondary means. All right, so Let's go to the next video. God's hardening is reactive to Pharaoh. All right, and so this is towards the end. He goes through several other passages, and I'll come back and walk through the passages. But essentially, that is key. That ignoring of that clause, as the Lord has said, to point back to Romans 7:3 is critical, because it allows him to land at his conclusion that he's going to get to.
Yeah. Exodus 8:32. But Pharaoh hardened his heart at this time also, neither would he let the people go. So who's hardening the heart now? Pharaoh. Exodus 9, verse 7. Then Pharaoh sent, and indeed not even one of the livestock of Israel was dead, but the heart of Pharaoh became hard, and he did not let the people go. So again, no one specifically named. So far along the progress, we have Pharaoh's heart becoming hard for no identifiable reason except for that he's rebelling against God. Then we have Pharaoh making his own heart hard. And then finally in Exodus chapter 9, we have God hardening Pharaoh's heart. I think the order of these events is important, and this is how God inspired it to be written, so we should take note. Exodus 9:12. But the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, and he did not heed them, just as the Lord had spoken to him. This is that same word, to strengthen or to firm up. And I do think this is an example of judicial hardening. Do you think Pharaoh deserved to have his heart hardened by God at this point? Doing it.
All right, so essentially he's landing in Exodus 9, and he's saying that God's hardening is now saw for the first time in Exodus 9. So meaning all of these places that comes before Exodus 9:12, which will be Exodus 13. We saw that one. Exodus 7:22. Down here it talks about, but the magicians of Egypt did the same with their secret arts, and Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he did not listen to them as the Lord has said. So he doesn't see this as God hardening Pharaoh's heart. He doesn't see any of the places that Exodus 8 talks about Pharaoh's heart being hardening. There's a couple in Exodus 8, Exodus 8:15, if we look there. But when Pharaoh saw that there was relief, he hardened his heart and did not listen to them, as the Lord says. So he says, this is Pharaoh now actively being an active person of hardening his own heart. And so therefore, his position is, now Pharaoh is the agent of hardening. God is not. And so if Pharaoh is the agent and God is not, then now Pharaoh is the one who is the sole volitional actor here. And if that's the case, if you keep going and you hold that position, you say, well, Pharaoh now is the one who's hardening his own heart. Verse 19, it occurs again. Then the magician said to Pharaoh, this is the finger of God, but Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he did not listen to them, as the Lord has said. Again, he doesn't respect this clause, as the Lord has said. So he says, look, Pharaoh's heart was just passively hardened, right? Hardened by some circumstance, whatever it might be. He probably hardened his own heart. But the problem is, if you even read this text, this event, unlike the last occurrence in Exodus 7:13, right here, the magicians tried their secret arts to bring forth gnats, but they could not. So there were gnats on man and beast. Then the magicians said to Pharaoh, this is the finger of God. So the magicians could not mimic the wonders of God through Aaron and Moses. And therefore, they warned Pharaoh that, hey, this has to be God, right? So there's nothing, even in the circumstance, that will cause God, that God can use as something, as a secondary cause to hardening Pharaoh's heart. So the question is, if this is passive, how does Pharaoh's heart gets hardened? Especially if you ignore as the Lord has said, right? So the monologist does not ignore as the Lord has said. So therefore they will understand at least that God is the one who hardened Pharaoh's heart. Do we know how particularly? Was it by primary means or secondary? Don't know. Would assume primary because there's nothing in the text context that gives you any secondary indications of God working. Right? And so another text would be verse 32. And it says, but Pharaoh hardened his heart this time, and he did not let the people go. Right? And so here Pharaoh is being stated as the one who hardened his own heart. Right? Now, this is the first time we don't see that clause as the Lord has said. But that clause has been there over and over again, as the Lord has said, as the Lord has said. And so the monologist continues with that pattern, being that every time Pharaoh's heart is hardened is the fulfillment of what God had already said in Romans 7:3, that God would do it. So despite Pharaoh being stated as the active agent in hardening his heart, I believe what this is showing is that God is holding Pharaoh responsible for the hardening, what's going on in his volitional faculties. Meaning, we looked at Genesis 1:24, when God commanded the earth to create the creatures after their kind. We said, well, how can the earth create creatures after their kind? It's impossible. It doesn't even have the faculties to do it. But then it said in the fulfillment passage in 25 that God created all the creatures after their kind. And therefore the earth gets credit for fulfilling the commandment of creating, even though it was God working through, the power of God working through the earth, the created entity, doing the action of creating the creatures, right? And I believe this is the same thing, that God can work on your volitional faculties, do a work, in this case here, hardening. But remember, he's still working through a created being. He's working through the created beings and working upon the created beings' volitional faculties. And therefore, it is appropriate and still logical to say Pharaoh hardened his own heart, despite it's God who's hardening his heart. God who's either primarily working on his volitional faculties, right? Or by secondary causes working on his volitional faculties. But all the same, Pharaoh is still the created being that the action is manifesting through. So it's still appropriate to say that Pharaoh hardened his heart, right? Because it's Pharaoh's volitional faculties. He's the being that's being worked on. Doesn't matter. God doesn't take into account that, oh, well, I'm the one who's operating on his faculties, so I can't give him any credit. I can't make him responsible or say that this is happening through Pharaoh. So that's the key, right? But all the same, notice that the clause is not here, but the monologist would actually have to make an inference in this case and apply that clause even here because it's been applied in all the previous cases, right? And so what he's doing is now he goes to getting back to the synergistic view. Let's go hop over to verse 12 in Exodus 9. We also see we see Pharaoh's heart was hardened in verse 7. Again, it's missing. It's missing the clause, but again, it's after Moses had performed the wonder, right? And it's in the context of still God calling for Pharaoh to let his people go. And we see Pharaoh's heart is hardened. And so again, the monologist would pull forth the promise that God is the one who's hardening Pharaoh's heart. Now, the synergist is not. The synergist totally ignores as the Lord has said. And basically now up until this point, they say there has been no place, no verse up until this point in which God explicitly, actively hardens Pharaoh's heart. And it says verse 12 is the first place that happens. And the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he did not listen to them, just as the Lord had spoken to Moses. So his conclusion is because you either see Pharaoh's heart being passively hardened or hardened by himself, that now God comes and hardens Pharaoh's heart actively because of what Pharaoh did in regards to his free will. Right? That's the difference. That is the difference. And so that is what he concludes in that last clip we looked at. I want to look at the next clip. And this is the last one. This is him summing up his position. Let's take a listen.
That I may show these signs of mine before him. Now God says, I have, past tense, hardened his heart and the hearts of his servants. What's interesting is this is just a few verses after 9:34, where it said that Pharaoh and his people, they hardened their own hearts. And this is the first time his servants are brought up with it, right? Pharaoh and his servants, they hardened their hearts. And then a few verses later, God goes, I hardened the heart of Pharaoh and his servants. It seems to me that there's some synergism going on here. There's something going on where Pharaoh's doing a hardening and God is doing a hardening. I think that seems pretty obvious from the text. And a lot of people seem to want to avoid it. They want to make it all Pharaoh's fault, or they want to make it all God's sovereign hardening. And it seems to me the text is showing that both is happening. God seems to be taking credit for Pharaoh in chapter 9, verse 34, hardening himself and his servants hardening themselves over here in chapter 10, verse 1.
All right, so what is he referring to? So his point and his conclusion is that this hardening is a synergistic work. It's a synergistic hardening. Synergistic because God is reacting to Pharaoh, hardening his own heart, and then God steps in and hardens Pharaoh's heart in Romans 9:12. If we scroll down towards the end of Romans 9 in verses 34, it gives this statement. It says, but when Pharaoh saw that the rain and the hail and the thunder had ceased, he sinned again and hardened his heart, he and his servants. Right? So here it says, it's showing Pharaoh is actively hardening his heart and his servants, But then it says in verse 35, Pharaoh's heart was hardened passively, right? It was hardened passively, and he did not let the sons of Israel go. And what clause do you see? Just as the Lord had spoken through Moses, right? Now, what he's saying, if you look at Romans 10:1, and read that one, it says, Then the Lord said to Moses, Go to Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart and the heart of his servants, that I may perform these signs of mine among them. So he's saying that now this is past tense work, that God has hardened his heart. And he's referring to the heart of Pharaoh and his servants. So now God is taking credit for the hardening that's done back in Romans 9:34. Despite it saying Pharaoh hardened his own heart. Right? He says essentially it is just God taking credit for Pharaoh's work. God isn't really the one who hardened it. He's just taking credit for it. It looks like God is taking credit for it. But again, like I just told you, is God is the one who's actively acting upon the willful faculties of Pharaoh. And so therefore God says he is the one who hardens. He promised that he will do it. This started off in 7:3. Now it has been fulfilled, right? It clearly says that here. And it goes along with how the monologist was using the clause as the Lord has said and pulling that throughout all the chapters, which is giving you the account of the hardening taking place, of the fulfillment of God's promise from Exodus 7:3. And so in that fulfillment, God is the active agent, and Pharaoh is hardening his heart because his will is being hardened. Is the one being hardening. Right? So the best way I can put it to you is that, when Paul says, I work harder than the rest, yet not I, but God in me. What Paul is saying is, what you see, the actions you see are truly coming from me. It's truly manifesting through me as the created being, the created vessel that God is moving to do his will. And so he says, I work harder than the rest. That's proper. That's appropriate. You see Paul as the created being working. You see his will moving and him acting. But Paul says, yet not I, but Christ in me, the power of God in me. Which he's saying is that it's God who's moving, who's acting upon his volitional faculties, that's causing his will to move, which allows you to see the actions manifesting from Paul as the vessel. Right? We talked about this last Saturday in our discussion in regards to the way of escape and man's ability. And in 2 Corinthians 4, it says Paul describes himself or the believers as having a treasure within earthen vessels, so that the power will be of God, not of ourselves, in our life in Christ. And the power that allows us to overcome temptations, testings, and trials. So if you look at this in that same way, you won't get confused when you see something like God is saying in verse 10:1, he is the one who hardened Pharaoh's heart and his servants, um, opposed to, well, not opposed to, but in conjunction with what it says in verse 34, that Pharaoh and his servants they sinned and hardened their own hearts. Like, the sin is God basically still holding them responsible for the hardening, the action that manifests from the hardening, right? And so when you understand that, you don't get caught up. And so what his position is that no, there's a synergistic work, and in this case, God is merely just taking the credit for what Pharaoh and his servants has done. Meaning, Pharaoh and the servants are the cause, the primary cause, not God. Right? That is his position that he's landing on. I'm sorry. And I think there's one more. Let me see. Was there one more video? No. All right. So now that we saw all the clips and we saw the position, let's hop back over to Romans 9. Right? So let's summarize what we just heard. We just heard that the synergist believes that Paul points us to Exodus and the hardening of Pharaoh in order that we understand that there is a synergistic work of God and Pharaoh and man in this hardening. And that God hardens only because of what Pharaoh does. And that is what he wants us to understand. Now, let's take that understanding and plug it into the context, right? The first thing we want to do is let's look at what we studied last week, verses 19 through 24. Is there a connection between verses 17 and 18 and 19? I would say yes, there is a connection. The connection is seen in the question or the objection that's raised, the complaint that's brought forth, and the objection that is raised by Paul himself. He tells his audience, those who would be challenging him, he tells them, this is what you will say to me based upon what I just stated to you in verses 14 through 18. Right? He says, you will say to me then, why does he still find fault? Now let's stop right there. Why would Paul say, or let me put it like this. Would Paul raise this question on behalf of his challengers if his understanding of his own argument that he just put forth to them was that God hardens because of your own volitional disobedience, persistence in disobedience, your own heart, you hardening yourself first. God hardens you because you harden yourself first. Therefore, you will say to me then, why does he still find fault? That's That's odd, Paul. Like, why would we raise that objection? You just said, we understood you as saying God hardens because of our own actions, because we harden ourselves first. He reacts and responds to us. So why why would I ask why would he still find fault? Clearly he's hardening me because he's found fault, right? His hardening is really a punishment to me hardening myself. So of course he's just. Of course I'm at fault. Why would you? No, Paul, that's not what I'm gonna raise. That's not my objection that I have. I don't see a problem with what you just said. And then Paul says, your second question you're gonna ask is, for who resists his will? Let me see, Paul. Why would I ask that question? I mean, clearly, I was able to act according to my own free will, and if I have free will, even when God acted upon my will or my faculties, I still had the final self-determining cause to whether I wanted to continue in rebellion or if I just wanted to be firm or strengthened in my own rebellious disposition. I could have clearly I could have resisted that because I have free will, Paul. No, I don't think I would ask that question either. You see where I'm going with this? Like, if we hold that that's what Paul's intention was in using this passage in regards to Pharaoh's hardening, then this objection in verse 9 doesn't really make sense. The questions that Paul raised in verse 19 aren't valid. And so the questions in verse 19 implies that there is some reason that the person who's being brought to judgment shouldn't be held liable. You shouldn't be. There's no way I could be found at fault. That's the only reason I would say in the courtroom to the judge, well, hey, why do you still find fault with me? I had to see something in a discovery, in an evidence that basically made it seem, that basically made it show that, hey, there's, I shouldn't be put to blame. You shouldn't find fault with me. I didn't do it. I didn't do anything. Or better yet, I couldn't do anything. Is what they're trying to get at, because the second question tells you, I'm saying, for who resists his will? Meaning, the reason why I'm raising my first question of why do you find fault with me is because no one can resist your will. My question of who resists his will, who can resist God's will, implies that no one can resist his will, is basically what's being presented against me. Right? The evidence shows that no one can resist his will, so I shouldn't be found to have fault. Like, why would I have fault? If the evidence is showing no one can resist his will. Well, how would Paul conclude? How would you find evidence of no one can resist his will? Does that evidence or argument is established by the synergist understanding of verse 17 through 18? Or is it established because Paul is telling you his clear understanding of how God works in regards to hardening based on what he has established in his foundation of his argument built up in Romans 9, 6 through 14. Right? So, meaning, is Paul basically, is he shedding light on Exodus and the account of Pharaoh by giving us these foundational arguments that can be found from verse 6 through 14? I think that is what the case is, right? Because remember, we looked in Exodus, and I tried to show you how the monogists would read Exodus. As the Lord has said, that the monogists would read that and carry that through and say, look, God in Exodus 4 and in 4:21 and Exodus 7:3 has said he will harden Pharaoh's heart, and everything that comes after it is the fulfillment of God's working. Doesn't matter whether it was passive, doesn't matter if it said Pharaoh did it or God did it, because everything points back to what God had promised, and that was he said he will harden Pharaoh's heart, right? Now, if that's not explicit to some people, if that's not something that's really clear to you, I believe when we understand what comes before Paul's usage of these verses these quotes of Exodus 7, and actually I think this is a quote from Exodus 9 when he talks about God has raised you up for this purpose. But the reason why why Paul has used this is to solidify what he's already established from verses 6 through 14 of Romans 9. Let me help you, right? So again, we can't ignore the objection. The objection says, for who resists his will? There's something within the evidence that speaks to a resistance or a question that will cause me to ask a question of who can resist God's will, right? Am I getting that totally from verse 17 through 18? No, let's go back a little bit. Let's go to verse 14. Actually, let's just work our way back. Let's go to verse 15. For he says to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I have compassion. And then so it says in verse 16, so then it does not depend on the man who wills or the man who runs, but on God who has mercy. So here's where we're seeing this ideal of a dependence on on God's will or man's will. And in verse 16, it says it does not depend on the man who wills. So here's the connector. Okay, here's what we're seeing that makes sense and why Paul would raise this final question of for who resists his will is because he makes this statement about it not depending upon the man who wills. You see the connection? Or the man who runs. but on God who has mercy. So if it's not dependent on man's will, and it gives a analogy of the man who runs to better explain what he's saying about not depending on man's will, but on God's mercy, it would make sense for us to understand why Paul raises this question. This question for those who would challenge him. He says, "You will ask me for who resists his will," because it's not dependent upon man's will. So if it's not dependent on my will, that means it's not dependent on anything that I'm doing, but on God who has mercy. But it's dependent upon God. And then we get this for to expound upon what Paul is saying in verse 16. For the scripture says to Pharaoh, "For this very purpose I raised you up to demonstrate my power in you, and that my name might be proclaimed through the whole earth." And so, interestingly enough, if we go to, let's look at the parallel on this really quick. I want to, all right. I want to make sure, I have so many verses in my mind for Exodus. I kind of forgot which one is that one paraphrasing exactly. So if we go to Romans 9, I think that's 17, and we look at the parallel. All right, so that's the parallel. Oh, sorry, it's Exodus 9:16, right? So if we look at Exodus 9:16, I think we're already there. How does this read? "But indeed, for this reason I have allowed you to remain, in order to show you my power, in order to proclaim my name through all the earth." So Paul is kind of giving you to me, when I read this, Paul is kind of giving you his understanding of God's working by using this ideal in Exodus 9. And I think it's not just this particular verse that Paul is pointing to, but it's a conjunction of how God has worked in this whole event, in which leads him to come up with the phrase of God has raised you up for this purpose. Speaking of God's sovereignty, because that is connecting his argument and what he's trying to bring home in what he started in verse 16 and 15, right? And remember, verse 15 and 16 came from a particular reason too. It came from another objection that Paul's raised for his challenges. He says, this is what you should question. This is the question you will say after whatever he spoke of from 16 through 13. He says, "What shall we say then? There is no injustice with God, is there? May it never be." And the question, we have to ask the same question. Why would they find injustice with God? And how is the answer of "I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I have compassion" helpful in answering that question? Right? And so the point being here in short is that the synergistic view does not fit into the flow of thought, or the argument don't fit into the foundational argument that Paul is building up in Romans 9. To say that Paul is saying, well, God is reacting to man's hardening of himself, and then he's hardening them. So there's synergistic work, causes verse 19 to make no sense at all. Verse 19 does not fit there. It turns Paul's argument on its head. Right? And so I think that's pretty much all I'm going to convey this week in this video. But I look forward to any questions or any objections that might come up in our discussion / study on Wednesday. Remember, that is 4:30 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. It will be this, I'm sorry, not Thursday, I said it's this Wednesday. You can find that event on meetup.com. You can find it on my Facebook page, Limbs of Christ, to get to that event. Be sure to RSVP so I know who's coming. Make sure you join a group. Subscribe to the YouTube video so you can pick up on all the new teachings that I release on a weekly basis. I hope this was helpful to someone, and I hope you go home and you go away and ask yourself these questions of which position is allowing Paul or God through Paul to convey the foundational argument that is being established from Romans 9:6 all the way up into verse 24. Is Paul giving you his understanding of God's working in Exodus, or is he calling for you to go back to Exodus to try to pull forth or infer some idea of how God is working in Exodus to apply that to Romans 9 for you to better understand Romans 9? I personally believe it's the former, right? I believe that Paul is giving you his explanation of how God is working in Exodus by establishing a foundational argument that uses Old Testament scriptures in Romans 9, and it's threefold. The first foundation to Paul's argument, or answer to his objectors for why aren't all of God's chosen people believing, is that not all who are of Israel are of Israel. Not that God's chosen people is not based upon descendants or blood descendants. It's based upon God's choice. And his next foundational argument is that because it's based upon God's choice and there's no injustice with God, it's because God has, even from the beginning, from when he called Israel and chose them to be his people, he says, look, I told Moses, I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy and compassion on whom I have compassion. It was never based upon the one who wills or the one who runs. It was never based upon man's works. In fact, that's why he states he's basically building upon what he stated in regards to Esau and Jacob, that his decision, his choice that he made was before either one of them had done any good or bad. It's not based upon their will, right? So if those are two of Paul's foundational arguments, how can now our understanding of what Paul is conveying in Romans 17:18 be that Paul is trying to teach that God hardens because of man's volitional actions. Man hardening their own hearts. That seems problematic, and the only way you can get there if you try to pick these verses out of context, right? But when you keep things in context, you just can't get there, right? So until the next time, be blessed and do not go beyond what is written.